Today on Junkyard Storytime, we are here to look at the cheapest trim level of a popular Japanese sports car. This is a 1987 Toyota Celica ST. Let's take a look. To understand this Celica, first we need to go back to the prior generation Celicas. Those are called the A40 and the A60. Those are the ones that were in production from late 70s through the early 80s. Now, those were both four-cylinder cars, but they actually had a submodel called the Celica Supra. Now, the Celica and the Celica Supra, they were both rear-wheel drive, but the Supra came with a six-cylinder engine instead of the four-pot that came in the Celica. So the Celica line of cars actually spawned the Supra, which is cool, but then the Supra split off into its own model, and that was in 1986. So in the same year that the Supra was launched, the Celica completely changed, and it became the front-wheel drive T160 generation that we have here. Now, this was a huge departure from the previous gen because it was a transition from rear-wheel drive to front-wheel drive. So in the same year, you have the Celica completely changing. The Supra, as far as I know, is all new, and now they are not connected at all. Now, instead of being a lesser powered little brother to the Supra, so the Celica was just more like the Supra's cousin. So think back to the mid-80s, and there were a ton of lightweight, sporty front-wheel drive coupes in this era, and that market grew even more into the 90s. So the Celica basically falls into that category. Some of the cars in that category didn't really have any sports car DNA, but it kind of makes sense when you consider that a lot of these cars, they share their platform and their powertrain with more daily driver type commuter plain sedans. This car, this Celica, has the same powertrain basically that was in the Camry, and it's actually built on a platform that some other front-wheel drive sedans used. So, I mean, the platform sharing thing, it makes sense. It's cheaper to design, and sporty coupes make a small percentage of the overall market, so it's not really a surprise the rear-wheel drive Celica didn't survive, and the rear-wheel drive Supra kind of took its place in the market, and the two didn't coexist as rear-wheel drive for very long. Now, under the hood here, you can see the remains of a 3S FE engine. This was a 2-liter power plant with dual overhead cams, and it made 115 horsepower and 124 foot-pounds of torque. Car weighed about 2,500 pounds. This one does have the automatic transmission, but you can get them in a 5-speed manual, which is kind of cool because in 1987, a lot of cars, the manuals still only came with a 4-speed. Like I said, this is the ST version. They also made a GTS version of the Celica, and that came with a more powerful 2-liter engine that actually made 20 more horsepower. And one of the really special things about this generation of Celica is that Toyota gave us the all-track turbo for the first time, and this was an all-wheel drive performance Celica that was based on their rally car. Now, I don't think you're going to see an all-track in a junkyard anytime soon, but they are really special cars, and if you ever see one at Cars and Coffee, definitely try to stick around and see if you can talk to the owner. Now, my 80s car nostalgia really trips hard when I look at the interior of this Celica. You can see this car has all the hard edges and the squared off lines that made Japanese cars from this era have a very distinct look. It's not quite as extreme as a first-gen MR2 or a Subaru XT or some other cars like that, but the influence is definitely here. You see the cockpit-style buttons on either side of the gauge cluster. Some of the buttons for the climate control look like something from a VCR. The stereo looks like an actual VCR, but this is pretty short-lived. I think this trend only lasted a few years in the late 80s into the early 90s. The real star of the interior, in my opinion, is the seats. You can see they're like a two-tone cloth design. The headrests are a funny shape because they're a lot wider than they are tall. The middle of the seats is like a textured cloth, and then the side bolstering is like a smooth cloth. Very unusual. The tops of the seats have this sculpted shape, almost resembling like human shoulders, and I don't remember seeing any other cloth seats that look like this, but it was the 80s. It was a wild time for car seats. I will stand by my claim that 80s cloth seats are the best. Not only do they last longer than a lot of other eras, but they last longer than leather from the same era. I had a 1989 Acura Legend with absolutely mint cloth seats. So where does this Celica fit into the lineup of the other cars that it competed against? Well, it's the lowest trim level of a front-wheel drive sporty coupe. So some of the cars that it would have competed in at this time would have been the Mazda MX-6, the Acura Integra, the Nissan Pulsar NX, the Honda Prelude, and the aforementioned Subaru XT. There may be others, but depending on how broadly you want to define a sporty two-door car, you could also compare it with things like the Honda CRX, Volkswagen Golf, Pontiac Le Mans, Ford Escort, Plymouth Sundance, Pontiac Grand Am made a two-door, and there were a ton others. I mean, this was a major time of transition with cars because a lot of companies are moving from rear-wheel drive to front-wheel drive, and they were just trying things in the marketplace. Now, there was a huge expansion of the sporty front-wheel drive car when the 90s arrived, and then there were even more coupes in the 2000s. I'm just going to list off a quick list of a few of the highlights that you might remember from back in the day, just roughly in chronological order. Ford Probe, Corolla AE92 Sport Coupe, Mitsubishi Eclipse, Geostorm, Chevy Beretta, Saturn SC, Toyota Paseo, Pontiac Sunfire, Nissan 200SX, Hyundai Tiburon, Scion TC, Kia Forte Coupe. There are a ton of others. I apologize if I left out your favorite. Quick shout out to the Nissan 200SX because that also was a rear-wheel drive car in the 80s, and then it made a transition to a front-wheel drive platform, I think, in the 90s. So just throwing that out there. Something happened in recent years, though. I don't know if you've noticed, but the sporty front-wheel drive coupes have disappeared. Now, if you look around, you'll see a lot of the sedan models have dropped their coupe options from their lineup. Kia Forte is an example. Nissan Altima. There's definitely others. I mean, companies have made it clear within the last few years the sporty coupe made from sedan cars, they don't sell. And so it doesn't warrant keeping them around. So one by one, they've just silently stopped being made. Here are some statistics that kind of surprised me when I started looking this up. So let's talk about car models that have two doors, so coupe or hatchback. Let's compare 87 to today. So in 1987, Toyota sold 5 two-door cars, and today they only sell 2 of them, the GR86 and the Supra, and both of those are dedicated sports cars. Nissan in 87, they sold 4 of these two-door cars. Today they only sell 2, and that's the Z and the GTR, and both of those are dedicated sports cars. Lastly, the one that really blew my mind, in 1987, Honda had 4 car models that only had 2 doors, and today they have 0. That shocked me, but I looked it up. I couldn't find any coupes, and sure enough, Honda doesn't sell any coupes or 2 doors today whatsoever in the North American market. So what does that make this Celica? I hate to say it, but it's a dinosaur. I mean, not because it's old, just because it doesn't have any equivalent that exists in the new car market today, and there's no evidence of that stuff coming back anytime soon. The message from the automotive industry seems pretty clear. If you want a 2-door car, you need to be prepared to buy an actual sports or GT car, because the companies are not going to sell you something with coupe styling for reasonable money. So if you want something like that, you better get it now, because cars like this are only going to get more rare on our roads. Thanks so much for watching. Hopefully we'll see you in the next video.